I'm sure you have a lot of questions for Maria, but please hold them. We'll hear from Professor Enright first before we do the Q&A session. And again, Professor Enright will need no introduction at all. Back in 1997, he actually published a very insightful book called Hong Kong Advantage, setting out Hong Kong's unique combinations and our role in the region, as well as in the world economy. And one of his recent books include China into the Future, Making Sense of the World's Most Dynamic Economy. He's also called one of the world's leading strategy gurus by the Academy of International Business. Professor Michael Enright is the Sun Hung Kai Professor at the School of Business of the University of Hong Kong and also the Director of the Asia Pacific Competitiveness Program at the Hong Kong Institute of Economics and Business Strategy. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Enright.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be here. A lot of familiar faces in the audience. I come at the issue of looking at SMEs, working with SMEs, and government policy towards small, medium-sized enterprises from a few different perspectives. I've actually been working with governments, multilateral agencies on these issues for about 25 years or so. And I also happen to be part owner of an SME, little consulting company with 10 people. My partner is my wife. Half of our employees are PhDs. The other half have at least one master's, which means it's a completely unmanageable workforce. We can pick that up later. One of the things that's quite striking, we have to actually take a step back. Why is it that governments support SMEs and SME development in the first place? I would claim it goes back a long time. In the West, support for SMEs has been popular since the early 70s with the publication of the book Small is Beautiful by E.F. Schumacher. Gave voice to the idea that development through small firms was a viable and in some ways maybe even preferable situation than development through large firms. This view is, of course, furthered by results in the U.S. that showed a sizable portion of employment was generated by small and medium-sized enterprises, by the growth of high-tech industries built around startups in the U.S. But it was really the success of the economies in places like Germany, Switzerland, Italy, driven by clusters of small and medium-sized enterprises that spanned most manufacturing sectors, machinery sectors, creative industries, consumer goods. It was really there that people got the notion that maybe this SME development was the right way to go and that government should be strongly supportive. The irony is that in all of the places I've mentioned so far at the time, there were virtually no policies or specific programs to support SMEs. It just happened, and then people picked it up and decided to run with it. Of course, the other reason why development around SMEs has caught the attention of governments is that there are just so many of them. Again, we've seen some of the numbers. In the EU, SMEs account for about 99.8% of companies, 70% of the workforce. In the U.S., companies with fewer than 500, that's large for Hong Kong, but it's SME for the U.S., is about 99.7% of enterprises, 50% of the workforce, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not surprising that countries and also groups started focusing on SME development. APEC founded its SME policy level group in 1994. ASEAN started a similar working group in 1995, and the OECD started a series of major SME programs starting in the year 2000. And what's striking is that over time we've actually seen a lot of convergence in terms of what governments have been doing in this area. And this is reflected in part in what we see the multilaterals doing, and in part what we see going on, of course, in individual countries. The APEC group initially focused on trying to figure out how governments could support SMEs by providing access to information, by providing alternative measures to finance SMEs, by overcoming or helping SMEs overcome the difficulty in obtaining technology and technology transfer, developing human resources, management and training resources, and also providing information and market access. Subsequently, the APEC group has added attention on female and minority-owned businesses, reducing the administrative burden that government places on small and medium-sized enterprises, and general improvements of the business environment for SMEs. This was actually similar to what the OECD came up with. I was involved in that. I wrote one of the policy papers for the original 2000 ministerial in Bologna. And there we focused on the notion of governments intervening, but only intervening when the market wouldn't provide an adequate solution. And again, we focused on a limited number of market failures, impacted information, the fact that it can be costly for small and medium-sized enterprises to get the information on markets, technology, competition, particularly when it deals with cross-border activities. Managerial myopia. Even if the managers had the information, in many cases, the managers in small and medium-sized enterprises are so stretched that they don't really know what to do with it. And management training became a major emphasis, at least in the work we were doing. Then the notion that public goods, education, infrastructure, etc., these are things that governments provide, but often they're not tailored to the specific needs that small and medium-sized companies have. And then finally, coordination failures. One of the ways to try to overcome the disadvantage of small size is through collective action. But the trouble with collective action is that it's often difficult for small and medium-sized enterprises to organize themselves. And sometimes it takes a government catalyst to help bring them together, help identify common interests, and then support common activities. And again, we see a number of programs that come out that are quite similar. If we look at Japan, for example, again, 99.7% of the enterprises, 70% of the workforce, and about 55% of GDP is small and medium-sized enterprises. What was striking in Japan is that up until 1999, the main idea behind SME programs was that, in a sense, SMEs were disadvantaged compared to large enterprises, and somehow this balance should be redressed. And there were a number of programs designed to, in essence, skew the playing field towards SMEs. But since 1999, the attitude in Japan has changed substantially. Instead of being viewed as sort of the weak brother or sister, SMEs are now viewed as potentially a driving force for economic development. The focus is not on creating the SME, not in handing the SME the keys to the kingdom, but rather on promoting the self-help efforts of the SMEs by providing support to the startup process, support for the innovative process, support in terms of strengthening the management of SMEs, because what all the research shows is that the reason why the vast majority of SMEs fail is that they don't know how to run a business. And we can have all our wonderful tech programs and all our wonderful Silicon Valley dreams, but if the SMEs can't run a business, if they can't balance a balance sheet, if they can't market to the market, that's why they go belly up. And that's, again, one of the focal points now of the programs we see in Japan. At the national level, there's a specific organization for small and medium-sized enterprises and regional innovation. It's an agency within METI. It has about 10 branches across Japan, 800 employees, 3,000 experts that they link up with SMEs to provide advice, 9 SME university campuses that are used as training centers, and capital budget of about $11.5 billion a year. Also, they're quite involved with local governments. And again, the activities are very interesting. It's consulting, support, it's hand-on with management, helping them work through business problems. It's business consultation, expert advice. It's seminars, training courses for managers and skilled workers. It's information on what's going on in local international markets. It's HR development. And yes, some of the traditional activities of running industrial parks, leasing out facilities, and financial support, those are there, but they're actually a much smaller part of the program than one might imagine, given the activities. Korea, we've seen a similar trend. Again, 99.8% of enterprises, 87% of the workforce, and 50% roughly or more of GDP is SMEs. And again, the policy shift towards SMEs is very similar to that in Japan. In the 1970s and 80s, the focus in Korea was on assisting SMEs in carving out some segments of the economy and protecting them from large firms, trying to help integrate SMEs into the supply chains of the chaebol, the large firms, and providing some of the credit and infrastructure and incubator support to do that. In the 1990s and then the 2000s, the emphasis has shifted. It shifted to try to foster the development of creative, innovative SMEs through a combination of looking at not just support, but fostering competition as well as cooperation across companies. The Small and Medium-Sized Business Corporation is the main agency involved in SME support in Korea. It's a nonprofit government-funded agency. It has 15 departments, 23 regional offices, 5 overseas offices, nearly 800 employees, and a budget on the order of $7 billion per year. Their main activities are in financing, consulting, training, overseas marketing, and linking companies to global partners. If you break that down, they again have some very interesting activities. They take it upon themselves to be a government-funded advocate for small and medium-sized enterprises when it comes to other government agencies and other government rules, regulations, and law. Skills enhancement, management training, HR development, improving market understanding, counseling, direct one-on-one counseling with entrepreneurs, fairly sophisticated business advisory services, enlisting leading-edge consultants to help the SMEs where the SMEs themselves could probably never afford it. Trying to foster cooperative links, again, linking together small and medium-sized firms to address markets on both a national and international scale. And if you have to summarize the bulk of their activities, they summarize it as building connections and building competences within SMEs in Korea. Again, which is a little different than what we tend to think of in many support programs. Again, I could go on and on, Singapore, Taiwan, it does go on and on. And the countries around the region differ in terms of the extent of their support. They differ in terms of the magnitude of the support and the exact mechanisms through which it's delivered. But increasingly, we're starting to see a convergence. We are seeing, again, the traditional provide some of the infrastructure, provide incubator support, provide mechanisms for financing. But increasingly, we're seeing the main thrusts be much more in helping SMEs develop as businesses, helping them understand their markets, helping them understand accounting, helping them understand finance, helping them understand all the things that a company needs to do in order to succeed. But the real question, of course, is, are these programs, are these policies doing what they're supposed to be doing? And I would say if we look around the region, there are a number of very strong positive developments we see as a result of these programs. A focus on SMEs has resulted in a sharp examination of the barriers to creating and growing new business around the region. That's a positive. A focus on SME development has fostered a focus on improving supply chains and reducing frictions up and down vertical and horizontal chains. It's helped reduce, in some cases, the political power of large entities. In many countries, it's fostered increased emphasis on competition across businesses. And in many instances, it's pointed out shortcomings in the financial sector that can be overcome. However, there's also starting to be a bit of an upswell of opinion that questions some of the SME development programs. One reason is that most SMEs never go near any support program. In the EU, where there's been extensive research done, no more than 5 to 10% of any of the SMEs that are eligible for support programs ever go close to one. And one wonders if 90 to 95% don't get involved, then how valuable may the programs be? Many SME programs assume or hope the program will develop the next Microsoft, Apple, or Dell, but in general, the dreams that SME programs are going to lead to the next Silicon Valley, those have not been well-founded in most situations. Another issue that can arise is that by focusing on SME programs, sometimes governments may lose track of programs and policies that they should have to cut across the economy as a whole. We may like SMEs from a political standpoint. They may be warm and fuzzy. But if there are things in our environment we have to fix for SMEs, well, then why don't we fix them for everybody, right? That becomes an interesting question, a question that's not really asked all that frequently. And then finally, you know, if you do look at the numbers, SMEs do tend to be the least productive companies in most economies. And if we support SMEs too much, are we actually allowing resources to stay trapped in lower productivity activities when maybe competition and pressure would force those resources to be used in more productive activities? So what is it that governments tend to get right? What is it they tend not to get so right? Getting the business basics right, that's critical. And many of the programs around the region do focus on that. Reducing the frictions associated with doing business, that's essential for SME development, and we see around the region a lot of governments are doing that right. Providing information, education, training, management development opportunities, those are very useful. We see a number of governments getting that right. And we also see in a number of instances government acting to coordinate firms in activities they couldn't coordinate themselves, and that again is beneficial. The one area that I would suggest that governments are not so successful is in fostering entrepreneurship. And here, it's this difficult balance. 25 years ago, I was addressing the meetings, the strategy sessions for an economic development agency of a country in the region. And the head of that agency said, how could he, as head of his nation's economic development agency, foster entrepreneurship in his country? And I looked at the 300 members of his organization around the room, and I said, fire all these people. I said, in your particular country, you take your best and brightest and give them cushy government jobs. Or you attract investment of large multinationals and give them cushy multinational jobs. Take your best and brightest, put them out on the street hungry, and you'll get more entrepreneurship than you know what to deal with. Because I would claim at the outset, people become entrepreneurial initially because they have to be more than that they want to be. So the challenge in being a supporting government is to provide the sufficient level of support without blunting the competitive pressure, the market pressure that any firm of any size will have to overcome if it's going to succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. If I may kick off the discussion with perhaps shooting a question at the Director General Maria, picking up on what Dr. William Fong said during lunchtime, that as he sees into the next 30 years, Hong Kong, apart from being the gateway for China to the whole world, we can also be the window into the mainland because of the booming consumer market. What are your thoughts there in terms of public-private partnership? What are the schemes? You've actually mentioned a long list of government measures, and I'm sure they go a long way to facilitating and nurturing SMEs. But what are your thoughts there? Which are the ones that you might do more? In actual fact, actually, promotion time. The Chamber actually have been advocating a two-tier taxation system whereby qualifying SMEs will only be taxed at 10% for the first $2 million for taxable profit. I wonder what are your thoughts there too?
Hello. It's working? Okay. Thank you for the questions. I think I can answer your last one first. Tax is not within my authority. So simple as that. You need to ask the right people. The second thing is, I think William made an insightful observation. I think he mentioned about the growth of the consumer market in mainland China. And I think he's probably right, you know, with this minimum wage increasing like 13% for the next 5 years. And we can see increasing affluence and the market, of course, with the population in mainland China. The other thing is with the increased connectivity between Hong Kong and the mainland, with the building of this bridge and the rapid rail and all that, we are looking at sort of reaching 100 million population, probably, within a reasonable span of time, probably an hour or so or something. So I think he's quite right in observing that that's the opportunity for Hong Kong in the next 30 years, probably, if not in the next 10 at least. So Hong Kong has always been known as the bridgehead into the mainland. But I think now. Previously, it's really leading investment in the mainland in manufacturing sector. But now mainland is becoming the consumer market rather than just, the manufacturing factory of the world. Referring to the government support measures, of course, I think if I recall, the ECIC has sort of covered, which also covers subsidiary companies of Hong Kong companies in the mainland. And in terms of the support measures I mentioned just now, a lot of them, of course, could be generally relevant, like loan financing scheme, loan guarantee schemes. It enables you to get fund to increase your business there. But on this SDF fund, which I mentioned at quite some length, that will definitely help because, in fact, in the last few years, we already are putting an emphasis on branding, on helping made by Hong Kong brands, made by Hong Kong products to develop brand and move into the mainland market. As I mentioned, we recently support some SDF projects to introduce made by Hong Kong products to shopping malls in the mainland and hope that because SMEs on their own, it's rather difficult for them to get into shopping malls because people don't know them and don't know what their credentials are, whether the product they sell is of the right quality or whatever. But under the sort of umbrella of industrial organizations and with government support, I think people have more confidence. I think that will definitely help. And we are definitely encouraging a lot of branding, upgrading, and restructuring work going from OEM to ODM and all that work using, the various funds, that the Trade and Industry Department administer.
Thank you very much, Director General. I have a very pertinent question from the floor, which says, do speakers agree that the business environment in Hong Kong is not conducive to SME development? Rental rates of offices and shops have skyrocketed, and SMEs usually don't have the bargaining power to negotiate with the landlords. What the Hong Kong government can do to help the SMEs? Professor Enright, would you like to take that question?
The single biggest obstacle that SMEs in Hong Kong face is costs, and it's cost of land. We could do away with every support program we have if we had a program that put more land on the market and reduced people's land costs and made it more certain. Okay, so that's the big thing that Hong Kong SMEs face, and it's not just the level, but it's also the fluctuations when you see rents change from one lease to another lease, 30, 40, 100 or more %. That's very difficult for individual SMEs. Having said that, if somebody else is willing to rent out the space, it means somebody is doing reasonable business, right? So we also have to look at that side of it, that somebody's doing the business, and we have to remember that if we think about Hong Kong's economy as a whole, we shouldn't necessarily be thinking of supporting particular SMEs or even the particular set of SMEs we have here at present, including my own. We should be having an environment that supports the development of existing new firms and the mix that adds the most to Hong Kong. But again, I think that property is the elephant in the room, and everything else is a rounding error for SMEs in Hong Kong.
Land policy will be beyond your remit too, right, Director General?
Right, of course. But I noted that Carrie Lam, I think in the past, has announced that first thing, she'll try to put more land on the market, and the other thing is trying to divide them into smaller parcels so that there'll be more competition. I agree that land cost in Hong Kong is an issue, but on the other hand, as we always say, it's not the cost side. Cost side is important, but at the end of the day, if you can make money, you can justify the cost somehow. So it all depends on whether you can have a product that is so successful that can sort of bring you profit, notwithstanding the cost involved.
Thank you. This question is also for the Director General. Echoing the main themes of today's summit, can you share with us what the Hong Kong government does on supporting business startups?
I think the various schemes I mentioned, can support both startups and established businesses. But in particular on startups, I think we have this business advisory services, which provide subject-specific advisory services to SMEs, including things on like planning or accounting or maybe getting licenses and all that. I think we also have a website that link up with different licensing services of government departments, which could help SMEs. The other is this mentorship scheme, thanks to our private sector partners, SME associations and trade associations and also professional bodies and other individual companies. They're all very willing to come forward and provide a mentorship program, which in fact lasts probably a year, and they're prepared to give some hands-on advice to the mentee. And I understand that this has been a very worthwhile process for both mentor and mentees. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. I think we're eating into your coffee time, actually, but this has been very insightful and interesting and very helpful and useful to the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, could you please join me in giving a big hand to our two distinguished speakers?